Hi, this is Amanda DeCadney, and you're listening to The Conversation. This week's guest is the formidable Suleika Jaouad. Suleika is a New York Times bestselling author. She's an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and she's the creator of the Isolation Journals, which is how I discovered her about 4 years ago. She is also the subject, along with her husband, Jean-Baptiste, of a phenomenal documentary called American Symphony. I could not be more excited to meet Suleika. This is one of those rare occasions where you may hear me fangirling over her just a little bit, because she's a woman who has endlessly impressed me with her powerful vulnerability in sharing her story of being diagnosed with leukemia at age 23 and again 2 years ago. I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did.
Hi, Amanda. It's so nice to meet you.
It's so nice to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Where are you based?
I'm in LA.
Okay.
Where are you?
I am at our farmhouse out in the Delaware River Valley, and I use this little cabin as my writing room. So it's a little sparse. But it works for me. I need no distractions.
Is it warm?
It's warm-ish.
Warm-ish.
In here, except for a wood-burning stove. So
that's so
more of an
nice.
art than a science, and it sounds far more romantic than it actually is.
I grew up in England, so I know the cold.
You know the cold.
You are one of the people that I was like, if I can do this in person with her, I just want to, but I just didn't know what was going on with your schedule.
Oh, well, we'll do an in-person thing at some other point.
And you're doing the Grammys.
And we're doing the Grammys, which, as you know, from being married to a musician,
it's a thing.
It's a production.
Yeah. Well, my husband was nominated for a Grammy during lockdown, which he ended up winning, but we were at everything was remote. And so
Right.
I know what it's like when you get nominated, but when he won, he was supposed to do a live feed to accept it. And he got the time zones wrong. And so we were in the pet store buying treats.
Amazing.
When they were like, "Where are you?" And we were like, "We're at the pet store." And they were like, "You're supposed to be doing a live feed for the Grammys now." And
please tell me he did the live thing from the pet store, because that would be pretty iconic.
He actually didn't, but the rest of his bandmates had to do it wherever they were from. I told him, you should just do it from the pet store. But,
well, it's also a cool look to be a no-show for your own acceptance speech.
I mean, that's somewhat his vibe, I will say. I got introduced to your husband's music through you.
Wow. I love when people say that. It makes me very happy.
Oh, same with me. I didn't know anything about your husband, weirdly, but I'm just going to give you some context about how you came on my radar, which was maybe 4 years ago now. And somehow Isolation Journals appeared, and it kept appearing. And I was like, what is this? And when I started reading it, I was like, I felt like I had discovered some kind of like secret place. It was so beautiful. And I'm a storyteller, and I believe in the power of shared experiences to transform our lives. And so what you create with the Isolation Journals just resonates so deeply with me. And I was talking about it with people for a long time, and like talking about you to people. And so when this film came out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the woman I've been talking about for so long. And so I'm just so happy to be talking to you.
Oh, well, the privilege is mine. And, the Isolation Journals came about in such a bizarre way. I was on book deadline. It was the early days of shutdown. And I don't know if you feel this way about your own creative process, but especially when I'm on deadline, there's always some idea that appears. My friend Liz Gilbert describes it as a mistress that appears, who's like doing the dance of the seven veils and saying, no, come over here, come over here. And so it really started on a whim, and it wasn't meant to be anything other than a simple, 30-day project and an exploration of journaling, which for me has been my way of staying grounded in all kinds of different chaos. And now it's gone from being my mistress project to the thing that dominates my time. But we love it. And it's such a tender, welcoming space and such a joy, exactly like you said, to see the power of story and what happens when we dare to be vulnerable and to share that vulnerability in writing. And there's a reverberation that happens. So, yeah.
Why do you think it resonates with so many people? Because you have, I think, 150,000 subscribers on Substack. That's a lot.
Yeah. So, we call it a newsletter because that's the form it's delivered in. It's, there's the free Sunday newsletter, but it's really become a creative community. And I know that for me, at so many points in my writing life and my painting life, there's a necessary self-isolation that needs to happen and a necessary solitude that you need to make friends with in order to sit your butt at a desk and to spend many hours, wandering alone in your brain and figuring out what you're trying to say. But I also think the creative community component of writing is so crucial. And for me, as someone who had never studied writing in a formal context before I began my career, it was always the missing piece. And so being able, to share my thoughts, but more than that, to be able to invite all kinds of different people, writers, artists, musicians, community leaders. One of our favorite contributors was a 7-year-old named Lou Sullivan, who's a 2-time brain cancer survivor, and offered his sort of meditation game that he plays when he's in the hospital, sharing real stories of people writing in the first person and grappling with whatever they're grappling, followed by a little prompt. And some people, religiously journal to those prompts. Other people use them as conversation prompts, as thought prompts. I think that piece of not just, sharing your own stories, but inviting others to respond to a prompt with stories of their own has really created this real sense of a community. We have, people who've started their own writing groups from meeting through the Isolation Journals, people who've gone on dates and become friends. And I think, at that particular moment in time where we were all, facing a global sense of isolation, which for me felt weirdly familiar, having, been in medical isolation for lots of my 20s, it gave people the tools to, cultivate their own creative practices, but also to feel a sense of connection to the larger wave of living.
Yeah, I mean, I pay for 2 Substacks and yours is one of them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. I've been most interested in moments of reckoning in my own life and my own work, and my reporting, because I think those moments where the ceiling caves in on you, be it, because of some, access shifting loss or illness or some other kind of heartbreak that brings you to the floor, really does have a clarifying effect. And, you get really clear on who you want to surround yourself with, what you want to do that's going to nourish you and get you through that belly of the beast. And for me, small joys, especially in the last 2 years, have felt like an anchoring point, because no matter how hard things might be, if I can locate one tiny joy, I start to notice the other small joys around me. Nadia Bolz-Weber says that the most powerful prayers are the ones born of despair. And I think the same is true of hunting for those small joys.
Yeah. Wow. What you articulated has been exactly my experience. And I think possibly one of the reasons why you and your work resonates so deeply with me is that I also believe that the moments that don't break us, that have been the most significant entryways for the most profound growth in my own life. And it's how I've been able to make sense of catastrophic events, is by when I'm able to put them to use in a way by sharing them with other people, which helps them and helps me. That really difficult experience is turned almost into it is turned into a blessing. It's what I've always tried to do through the work that I've created. And I see you've done that with your book that you wrote, Between Two Kingdoms, and with the TED Talk that you did, and with the Isolation Journals, and with this documentary film. Like, that's a thread that I see running through your work, is sharing your most vulnerable moments and your life experiences with whoever wants to resonate with that, whoever wants to connect to it. And it's almost like you've created this sort of, amazing community with the various things you've done, but in the world of people who feel less alone because of what you've shared with them. And that is an incredibly generous thing to do.
It's felt like a necessary way of moving through the hardest moments. I got diagnosed with leukemia when I was 22. I was a year out of college. And, prior to that diagnosis, I was like a typical, just hungry, ambitious striver. I had so many big dreams for the future. I had, my 1-year plan and my 5-year plan and my 10-year plan. And to, have my life interrupted in that way, to go from someone who was working 100 hours a week, running, 100 miles per minute, and to be forced to lie fallow, to be, stuck in a hospital bed for a year, was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through. And it wasn't like, I got the diagnosis and I was like, great, this is going to be a blessing, and it's going to launch me in new directions. It doesn't happen always like that. And for me, I had to rage and rail against those new limitations for a good year until I began to realize that there was really a choice. And the options were very clear. One was to allow this thing that had happened to me to leave me angry and embittered, especially at an age where you're watching your friends traveling the world and starting careers and doing all the other, big and small.
And you were living in Paris at the time.
I was living in Paris. I wanted to be
having sex with Will.
Having sex with Will.
Will. Oh,
Will. And, I spent that first year when I went into the hospital, I had all kinds of ideas about what I was going to do. In that time, I packed an entire suitcase full of books and told my parents I was going to use that first summer in the hospital to read through the rest of the Western canon, which of course I did not do. But it became clear to me that, either I could keep bumping up against those limitations and trying to deny what was happening, or I could accept it.
Yeah, you could get into acceptance
and figure out how to make it useful. And once I started doing that, I realized that though, whatever dreams and plans I'd had prior to this diagnosis weren't going to come to pass, at least not in the way that I'd imagined, that there was all kinds of stuff I could do from the confines of my bed. And that's what really launched me into the kind of writing that I do now. It wasn't reporting in the typical sense, but I was, reporting from the front lines of my hospital bed on the subject I knew best. And so that has been the kind of guiding principle for me is, when things implode, you have to get curious about the implosion. And there's always some interesting thing that can come out of it, even if it's not at all the thing that you imagined. And it's a thing I've had to do over and over and over again in my life. Honestly, that we all have to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think
the human condition.
It is. And, I was thinking you somewhere in something that I read that you wrote, you said, we can never know for sure how long we have. Uncertainty is a part of being human.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties into what you just said, which is, I think we feel safer with certainty. We don't want change. It's scary. The unknown is scary. And to understand at such a young age that impermanence is part of life, I mean, man, that we should all be able to know that and accept that, because the amount of energy that goes into, refusing to accept what is, that is where the pain has been for me, is in the resistance. Once the acceptance comes, that's where the growth can happen.
And we live in a culture that's so steeped in self-improvement, whether it's, changing the way we look, changing our weight, changing our productivity and our habits. And when everything exists in the aspirational, it's impossible to be present with whatever is happening.
Yeah, I think that is one of the hugest challenges for all of us, and is being present. And one of the biggest gifts that anyone can give us is their time.
Yeah.
That's what I feel about putting anything out in the world. I want to be respectful of people's time. And so if I'm asking them to read something or listen to something or watch something, I want them to leave with more than they showed up with. It feels like that's the respectful thing to do.
Yeah. And you want to be respectful of your own time. And that was something that came into very clear focus for me, at 22. The universe has a way of bopping you over the head again and again with the lessons that you need to learn.
Until you're like, fine, I get it.
Yeah. But I, for the first time in my life, wasn't dreaming big about the future. The future had become a really scary place because I didn't know if I was going to get to exist in that future. But more than that, I had such limited energy that, I had about 2 or 3 good hours a day. And when your energy is limited, when time doesn't feel infinite, you get really clear about what you want to do in that time. And, it might not look like what you thought it would. For me, it was, like trying to write, trying to figure out how to start a career in an unconventional set of circumstances. But more than that, I wanted to spend time with my family. I wanted to spend time with my very closest friends. I wanted to learn to get good with my own company, which was something that prior to all this, I hadn't made time for. I was always on to the next thing, always racing ahead.
certainly had time when you were in hospital for a year to get get comfortable with your own company, right?
Yeah. And, I think one of the hardest things about that experience, and I don't know if this resonates with you in terms of losing your dad last year, wasn't, for me, the illness itself or even the physical side effects, or it was the sense of isolation that I felt. And to feel alone in any kind of suffering, I think is one of the hardest human experiences. And so figuring out how to convert that sense of isolation into solitude, into time where I could be alone or not, but be okay with just sitting in my own company was one of the greatest gifts to emerge from that. Because if you can make peace with yourself when all of your fear is most alive, when your doubts, when your anxiety are heightened, there's a kind of sense of being bulletproof. I know that you turn whatever space I'm into from feeling like a kind of prison into a monastery.
Wow. I understand exactly what you're talking about. I think that one of the gifts of my dad's death, and I sort of say this, jokingly, but I mean it, that my dad's parting gift to me was myself.
Yeah.
Because prior to him leaving, I didn't really know that I could rely on myself to the depths that I did. And as you know, in those moments when the rubber meets the road and it's just you and your faith, whatever that is, for me, it was sort of me and my higher power and my faith in the universe, which is my God. And those moments when it is just you with yourself, you really get to know who you are in a way that you could never have known before. And that has been the gift of it, that I too am really okay with myself. And I'm really okay. And I hesitate to say this because I sort of know how the universe works, where it's like, oh God, I really don't want any other massive lessons right now, but, but I know I will be okay. So for the first time, I've had mini versions of this where I felt like I'm going to be okay. I got sober and got into recovery at 22. So I've spent my whole life, in recovery, but so I've had other moments of like, I know I'm going to be okay. But this last one was just a deepening of that knowledge. Of like, okay, I'm all right. No matter what the outcome is, if I lose anything that's left, I'm going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the challenge is to hold on to that every day.
Yes.
Hold on to that knowing. And that takes, for me, it takes practice and it takes faith. And faith takes practice.
Yeah.
So how do you hold on to that feeling?
And
how do you hold on to that feeling in the face of the fact that your cancer has returned?
Yeah. So, I spent a decade after I emerged from treatment rebuilding my life. But always, having this sense that the ceiling could cave in again at any moment. And my biggest fear was of a recurrence. And for a long time, I felt almost hesitant to rebuild, because it just felt like I wouldn't be able to survive the ceiling collapsing again. I didn't, not even physically, but just emotionally, spiritually, I couldn't even fathom the idea of going through what I'd been through once more. And it bled into every area of my life. When I was thinking about dating again after going through a breakup, I was like, first of all, how do I talk about the fact that I'm fresh out of treatment? How do I make plans for the future? How do I, think about marriage or having kids when I know that this thing could come back? And for a long time, I let that stall me. But at some point, when I was a couple years out, I started to regain a sense of safety in my body and a sense of safety in my future and the world. And then it did happen. The ceiling caved in again. And I had just published my book. I was, running the Isolation Journals. John and I were talking about getting married and starting a family. And I learned that not only was my leukemia back, but it was back with a vengeance. And I was going to need to start treatment immediately. I was going to need a second bone marrow transplant. And the interesting thing is that, as terrifying as all of that was, because my worst fear had come to pass, I was no longer afraid. And the thing I believed I couldn't endure, I knew that I was going to have to dig deep and find it within myself to get through it again. And it wasn't even a question. And that's, the interesting thing about confronting your fears is that they cease to be as scary when you look them directly in the eye. Georgia O'Keeffe has one of my favorite lines, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'll try to paraphrase it anyway. But she said something like, I've been afraid every single day of my life, and I've never let it stop me from doing a single thing. And that's the sense that I have now. It's not that I don't have fears. I have all kinds of fears. But because I've watched myself walk through those fears not once, but twice, and have, had to dig deep and realize that even when you feel like you don't have anything to pull from, there's always these hidden stores of strength. And that, even when the worst comes to pass, you're still okay. That a thing that I know is there, even when I don't always trust it's there. And so for me, journaling is really where I remind myself of those things. Because of course, when you're no longer in acute distress, it's easy to just kind of fall back into the rhythms of living, to fall back into old habits. But sometimes when I feel afraid, and it can be about the dumbest thing, I can feel nervous about some public speaking engagement, I sit in my journal and I make a record of all of the hard things that I've survived, to remind myself of my track record of resilience. And everyone has that. You don't survive childhood without some kind of little t or big T trauma. In order to be here, our ancestors had to survive all kinds of things. And I think, for me, reminding myself of the tenacity of the human spirit, of our ability to find creative workarounds to get through anything, is the thing that keeps me focused.
I wear this necklace that is a resilience symbol, which I bought. This is a necklace my dad gave me, and I put this resilience charm on it because that's been one of the things that I've continually, had to remind myself of, that I am resilient and that I do have what it takes. And, so often people just see the end result. And I think what's powerful about what you put out in the world is that you're sharing the process of the journey from the news of an experience to that place of acceptance, and I'm sure it ebbs and flows on a daily basis, but you're allowing people in on that process, which I think is so valuable because, and I'm sure obviously there's parts of your life that no one other than you and your partner probably, will know about, but what is shared is still on a level of vulnerability that it can give other people a roadmap, which I think is one of the biggest gifts we can share.
Yeah. Yeah. I've never been interested in offering advice and speaking from some mountaintop of wisdom.
I'm fixed place because that does not exist. Yeah.
It's not honest.
Yeah.
There aren't, we're constantly in transition. And I'm most interested not in where people arrive, but how they actually get there.
The journey.
Yeah.
I relate to that. The decision to make your film American Symphony is an ultimate testament to that. Mm. And I'm wondering why you chose to make the film, and also, did you have any idea what you were getting into?
Absolutely not. So, initially the film was going to be a short process film about my husband, John, composing his first symphony called American Symphony. And he was going to travel around the country and hand recruit and pick an orchestra as he imagined it to be in the 21st century. So there were going to be jazz musicians and classical musicians and native musicians and musicians who don't even read music, and to really try to think about, what a symphony would look like in the 21st century. And then a week later, our world drastically shifted. I learned the same week as he learned that he had been nominated for 11 Grammy Awards, that my leukemia was back. And within 24 hours, we had to rehome our dogs. We had to pack up our house and we had to move, and I started treatment. And it was just one of those moments where we were living these extreme contrasts and trying to figure out not only how to stay grounded individually, but how to stay connected together. And so we, I think like the best creative projects do, realize pretty early on that the documentary we'd set out to make wasn't going to be the documentary that we would end up making. And I think that's the beauty of a creative process. Like Matt Heineman, the director of American Symphony, always says that if you end up with a project that you started with, then you weren't listening carefully enough along the way. But we had no idea what we were getting into. And we were filming it in a sort of cinema verite kind of way.
It shot so well. It shot so well. I mean, it's really beautiful how it's shot.
But he, followed us from the moment we woke up until we went to sleep. And there were 1,500 hours of footage. And we had no idea what was going to come out of that. I mean, truthfully, I didn't know if I was going to survive long enough to actually see the film come together someday. And it was intrusive in all the ways that you can imagine. Having a camera in your most vulnerable moments from sunup until sundown sounds intrusive.
Did you think, when you're saying that you didn't know that you would live to see it completed, did you envision what that would look like in the documentary if you did not survive?
No, John and I would always joke. We said, if nothing else comes of this, we'll have the world's most beautifully shot home videos to, give to our family and friends. So I think we were more focused on capturing whatever was happening. And as we got, deeper into the process, meaning just the process of what was unfolding in our lives, the story became clearer. And, it's a love story. It's a story about creative partnership, which is something I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on. It's a story of how survival really becomes its own kind of creative act. And, John and I both believe that everyone is deeply creative. You don't have to make creativity your profession to benefit from a creative process. But this experience of being on these sort of polar opposite tracks forced us to find a new shared creative language to
I was going to say you'll have to learn a new language, because the polarity of experiences between intense success and intense sickness are profound. I mean, how did you hold both of those experiences, and for neither one of you to undermine the other's experience?
Yeah. So one of the very first things we did was we got married in the living room of our house the day before I was admitted to the hospital. And, we had been talking about getting married for years, and then the pandemic was ongoing, and we were like, we'll wait until we can have some big, wild party in New Orleans with a second line and all of our friends and family there. But John was so clear-eyed about it. And he said, I remember it so clearly, he said, we had a plan and we are not going to let this cancer get in the way of that plan. And that became the kind of guiding principle for us. So we did not have a huge, weekend extravaganza in New Orleans. It was us in our living room with 4 friends. Our house is still under construction. John rented a piano just for the night, and we ordered fried chicken and drank champagne, and we didn't even have rings yet. We used bread ties, and it was perfect.
It was so sweet. Seeing that in the film was so sweet and so beautiful, and such a testament to your commitment to your love.
Yeah. And I think also a testament to having to reimagine how you thought things were going to go, but still doing them anyway. And so that set the tenor for the next couple of months. When I was in the bone marrow transplant unit, I was there for about 6 weeks. And no immune system, even a cold at that point could be deadly. And John was having to perform
and traveling
which exposes you to all kinds of germs. And so there was a period of time where we couldn't see each other for about 2 weeks. And it was really important to me. I've known him since I was 13 years old. I've watched him work toward a moment like this for years and years, that he not miss out on this moment because of what was going on with my health. That would have not made me happy. It would have made me sad. It would have made me guilty. So it was important to me that he continue to, be out there doing what he needed to do in terms of his work. But we also had to figure out how to stay connected to each other.
Yeah. How did you do that?
Yeah. So
just from having a husband on tour, just that in itself, is quite a disconnecting experience, because they're in a bubble and they are, moving from city to city, and the entire thing evolves around them, and they have to put out energy every single night and be this kind of vessel for music. And if you don't have a plan in place, it can be disconnecting, just because you're just in everyday life, feeding the dogs and the toilet got blocked, and, and they're out doing this other very different thing. So even under normal circumstances, touring can put a strain on a marriage. So I am curious how you did stay connected.
I think it all comes down to creative workarounds. Years before I got sick, we had a rule, which was that we never went more than 3 weeks without seeing each other. We were both on the road a lot.
Ours was 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone has their time.
That we started doing was for both, we both keep journals. Instead of doing typical morning pages, we started writing each other letters in our journals, and we would snap a photo of it and send it to each other. Because what gets lost, especially when two people are on the road or one person's home and the other's on the road, is, you have your catch-up calls on the phone, but it's hard to get
to drop in. Yeah.
And so there would be things that could come up in these letters to each other that would never have come up in, our 20-minute nightly phone call. And so that kind of set the tone for us. And when I was in the hospital, hospitals are noisy places.
Yeah.
There's constantly some IV machine beeping or some alarm going off. And he started composing lullabies for me, that he would send to me, and I would play them on repeat. And it felt like he was right there in the room with me. And I started painting, which was not something I had done from the time I was a little kid, but I was on medications that was causing my vision to blur and double and made it really challenging to write, and definitely not a cathartic experience. And so I, rather than being frustrated by that, by not having access to the tool that has always gotten me through.
It soothed you, right? You've had that.
And I started, with these weird kind of biblical, nightmarish self-portraits. And so every day the conversation became not necessarily what had happened that day or what the latest test results were. It was, hey, look at this painting I just made. And he'd be like, hey, look at this lullaby I just composed for you. And I think it allowed us to not only find a way to stay connected to each other, but also to stay connected to ourselves.
Yeah. I think you should do an exhibition of those paintings. I think that would be so, I think it'd be so, I'd be so curious to see it. What is your current status with your diagnosis?
So I, unlike the first time around, don't have a cure in sight. I'm currently in remission, but I will be doing treatment indefinitely for however long or short that can be. So that's definitely thrust me into a deep ocean of uncertainty that when I first got that news, I was like, I don't even know how to keep my head above water here. Because, there's a sense that we can survive anything as long as there's an end date in sight. But when you don't have that end date, it becomes a lot harder to kind of calibrate your days and to figure out what you're working toward. I remember breaking down in a doctor's appointment when my oncologist told me that I would be doing treatment indefinitely. And he said, you're upset. What's upsetting you the most? And I said, the word indefinite. I don't know how to do this when there's no end date in sight. And what he said to me, which is what people often say in situations like this, is that you need to live every day as if it's your last. And every single time he would say that, even though it was coming from a good place, I just felt total panic. Like,
well, that's a pressure.
It's a pressure, right? It's like I'm in this race against time. I have to make the most out of every moment that I can. And I've come to believe that even though it's well-intentioned advice, it's actually bad advice. Because if we were all living every day as if it's our last, we'd be, declaring bankruptcy and emptying our accounts and eating ice cream all day and, cheating on our spouses or whatever. And so instead, I've kind of had to shift away from that. And I've shifted toward trying to live every day as if it's my first, which is to say, waking up with a sense of like curiosity and playfulness and wonder that a newborn baby might. And when I do that, I feel less pressure to make the most out of every moment. Instead, I'm just following my curiosity and figuring out what's life-giving and what I want to give and return. And so it's been a process. I'm a year and a half out from that second bone marrow transplant. But again, to come back to the piece about resilience, like this is not something that on the day that I got that news, I believed I could do. I couldn't imagine how I could live a full, happy, meaningful life while being in treatment forever. And yet, we had a plan and we're not letting this get in the way of that. And life looks so different to how we imagined. And it's harder in a lot of ways, but it's also infinitely more rich and beautiful because of what's happened.
Do you think that you are in a relationship with someone who so fully sees you and loves you for all parts of yourself that this experience with the second diagnosis is so much different because of that?
Honestly, having gone through a breakup the first time I got sick and seeing how an extreme stressor like an illness can metastasize to your relationship, I lived in fear of what would happen if I got sick again and if our relationship could survive that. And especially given, my husband's creative work and his travel schedule, I always thought this can work unless I get sick again. And that's not to say that I didn't believe in his capacity to show up and to be there, but I didn't trust that when the ceiling caved in, the relationship wouldn't also implode. And it's really surprised me because I think when you go through something like this with another person and you find ways to be connected, when you find ways to deepen your relationship, there's a sense of strength in the relationship that comes from that. And I think, I have dispelled any notions that I might have had, in my early 20s about relationships having this sort of linear trajectory. And so, in the past, when something really hard happened, the relationship wouldn't survive that. And so to have the experience of having been through all kinds of hard things, small things and big things, and to be able to sit with someone together within those hard circumstances and continue moving forward, that's given me a deep sense of faith and a newfound appreciation of what a relationship can be. Because it's not, you can't measure a relationship based on how it's going when everything is great. You can really measure it when everything goes to shit. And you still can tap into that love, into that sense of connection, even maybe especially when it's hard to do that.
Yeah, you see who people are in a crisis.
You do.
That's when you really see who people are. Do you guys do therapy together, or what are the things that you do that help you stay connected?
Yeah. So, we've done couples therapy. We believe couples therapy is like, getting an oil change on your car.
Same. I always say to people before they get married, I'm like, please get into couples therapy now so that you've got a language and a space for whenever things come up, you just know you do what you've always done, which is you talk about it with your therapist.
Exactly. And you have the tools to do that. And you have the comfort with having those kind of conversations before things get really hard.
Yes.
And so therapy, not just couples therapy, but individual therapy, is something that is hugely important. I also think, John talks about this in the film that, fame can cause a bifurcation of self. Like you're leading a double life. There's your private life and your public self. And so for us, we protect that private self, as much as we can. Why we live in the middle of nowhere. And we really cherish the quality of the time that we spend together. It's not about spending every day, all day together. We're both introverts. We both have our own creative projects going on. But when you come together at the end of a long day or at the end of a long tour, really, making time for us to be together. And then I think our creative practices are crucial to that, and respecting each other's creative practices. So John left this morning for a 2-month tour, and someone said to me, "Isn't that hard for you?" And I said, "No, I love it. I'm going to spend the next 2 months working on my next book and painting and preparing for my first big art exhibit this summer." And it's not that I don't miss him. I do miss him, but it's also a beautiful thing to miss someone.
Yeah, I married a touring musician for a reason. I like the time. Mine just came back off tour after like a 2-year tour, and it's,
Yeah, it's an adjustment.
For sure. Because all of those things that you got in the routine of doing, now there's a new schedule because the schedule's changed. There's one more person in the house. But I'm happy to hear you are doing an exhibition.
Yes. Yeah. How do you two stay connected in the midst of?
Well, we have children, and when they were younger, it was harder for me to go on tour because the kids were in school and I didn't want to pull them out all the time. And so we had a 2-week rule, where he would come home every 2 weeks, which sort of extended the tour somewhat because, he would be coming home for a week. Every 2 weeks, he would come home. So that, there's all kinds of implications with that. As the kids got older, we would, for example, over the summer, that's a 3-month run of festivals, we go. So, this summer we were in Japan, we were in Paris and London, we were traveling around the States. We pick places to go. I think thank God for FaceTime. Before FaceTime, it was definitely a lot harder. And, when he went from sharing a bus with his band, it was much harder to have privacy than when he was traveling on a plane or his own bus. In case you can have more time to actually connect in a more intimate way because there's not other people that can hear him, So I've been with him for 23 years. And when we met, his first album had not even come out. So it's been this wild journey. And when I was watching American Symphony and I was watching your husband at all of the events and all of the people, and I had a moment, there was a shot of you FaceTiming him when he was at an event or something. And I had a moment of thinking, I think I would feel a bit jealous. I would feel a bit jealous, like, oh, my partner is out in the world having this moment of a lifetime and I'm here. And I wondered, it's not the most positive thought, but that's what I thought. And I wondered if you had any feelings like that.
You know what's interesting? in my first relationship, when I went through illness, he was there every day. And I had a harder time, in spite of him being there every day, with the idea that he was out and about in the world and that I was living in this parallel universe. I was living in the ecosystem of the hospital. This time around, I truthfully didn't, because I knew that where John wanted to be more than anything was in that hospital room. John doesn't drink. He's never even had a sip of caffeine. He doesn't enjoy necessarily those kinds of events. He's a deep introvert, a deep nerd in the most beautiful way. And his joy is like being at home in his home studio and doing that. And so because I could feel that where his heart wasn't in those spaces. And I think in some ways it was harder for him to be away when I was so sick than for me to have him not there. And because he was showing up, even just in composing those daily lullabies, I didn't feel that way. But the other piece of this too, I think, when you work in a creative field, and especially if you're married to someone else who's also in a creative field, is that something that's been crucial to us is really building our village. We have so much chosen family that we have conscientiously cultivated over the last decade because, that's how we get through. So when John's on tour, my best friend lives a few blocks away from me. Our neighbor who we share a wall with is another one of my good friends, and they're doing their creative work. And I have, my sister wives around me. And I think that was also the big difference. It's not just that I could feel that John wanted to be there more than anything else, but that also, I had a community. I don't rely only on my significant other.
Yeah, that's not healthy to do that.
And nourishment. I've diversified. I have lots of, friends and creative mentors and people who nourish me in other ways, in a way that I didn't have in my early 20s. And so, and I really believe that resilience is tied to community.
Because that's a full circle.
Yeah. Whether it's having a baby or being a writer or a musician, you need people around you, and you need to invest in that community long before you need help or support. And when you do that, and something like a life-threatening illness comes about, you have your people there to hold you, and it's not hinging on one person.
Well, there's a few things you brought up here. One, the importance of knowing that your partner is not your sole source for everything. I think that is something so crucial that I also learned, that my community, my tribe of ladies specifically, are such sustenance for me. And I have elders in my community that guide me with so many things. I believe in mentorship. I have a mentee. I am mentored. I really believe in the power of intergenerational knowledge, and that, this is Gloria Steinem who said this, that we are all linked, and we are linked, not ranked. And I believe that. I have one hand out in front of me to my mentor, and I have one hand out behind me to my mentee. And I truly believe in that. I'm sort of raised and held together by the community that I have. And in thinking about that, in your latest newsletter, you talked about times in the past where you had got a friend's bad news and that you didn't show up. And I thought that was very vulnerable to share that. And I wanted to know if you can speak about your own experience with, obviously, so many people have shown up for you, but can you speak about the times when people have not been able to show up for you and how you've navigated that experience. Because a lot of people, including myself, as I said, we get to see who people are in a crisis. And there are people who were on my favorites on my iPhone that did not show up. In fact, they actively left the relationship.
Yeah.
And that was sort of loss on top of loss for me.
Yes.
I was navigating the death of my dad. It was like, oh my God, and now I'm losing you too.
Yes.
And it's a very specific kind of pain, and it's not uncommon. So I was curious if you could speak to your experience with that.
Yeah. I think similarly to what you experienced, maybe the greatest heartbreak for me when I first got sick at 22 were the people I thought were going to be there who weren't there at all. And I was 22. My friends were like staying up until outrageous hours and going out dancing. And the people I'd played beer pong with in college weren't necessarily the people sitting next to my hospital bed as my hair was falling out. And so I remember feeling so deeply hurt by that. And I think, there's a reason why when we hear of someone's, tragic news, we say words fail. But I think what happens sometimes when we don't know what to say is that we end up not saying anything at all and staying away because of it. We're not comfortable with grief. We're not comfortable with confronting our mortality. But more than realizing who my real friends weren't, I think that experience made me realize who I wanted to be friends with. Because while the people I expected to be there weren't always there were all kinds of people who came out of the woodwork and who were extraordinarily generous and supportive and really raised the bar for me of the kind of friend I want to be to other people in those situations. That really taught me the value of showing up, of saying, when you don't know what to say, exactly that. I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm here. And so, I'm no different to anyone else. In spite of that, when I hear of a friend who's relapsed, what I feel is fear. Fear that I won't have the right words. Fear because it's triggering to hear of someone else getting sick. But I know that, finding the perfect words, finding the perfect gift is not actually what's needed. It's presence. And so I, have really tried to emulate the generosity that I've been the recipient of, and to do away with the perfect gesture and to simply try to be present for the people that I love most. Because that's the moment of accountability that all relationships arc toward, is how we show up when things are hard.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I do think that for me as well, having compassion for the fact that, as you said, people are afraid of facing their own mortality. And I think there are entire, psychological philosophies that are rooted in the fact that people do everything and anything to avoid the inevitability, the only inevitability that we are all going to die one day.
Exactly.
But when and how, is up for grabs, but that's the only one thing we know for sure. And people avoid that reality and go to great lengths to do so. And so, the first year, I had a lot of anger and sadness. I would cry endlessly, just sobbing about, loss on top of loss. And then now, sort of 18 months later, I've gotten to a place of acceptance and also compassion that, not everyone can handle being faced with this. And it's actually selfish and unrealistic of me to expect everyone in my life to be able to hold my grief.
Yeah.
It's okay that they can't. And like you, there were people who complete strangers that sent me books or sent me thoughtful cards, or people that I hadn't had contact with for years that like contacted me and sent me beautiful voice messages or just sent love. And that, oh my gosh, that was so beautiful and so powerful. The kindness of strangers and people who I had not heard from in years, it was profound, that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, we've all been there where we sit down to write a really thoughtful note to someone and we start a draft and then we put it off and we try it again. And then enough time has passed that you feel like it's too late to reach out. I've done that. I've been the recipient of that kind of silence. And I think that compassion is so crucial. People are struggling in all kinds of ways, known and unknown. That might mean that they can't be your person in that moment, but there is a person out there who can be your person. And the friendships forged from that shared experience of grief or hardship are, to me, the deepest friendships I've had the privilege of forming in my life.
So I'm very curious what is going to manifest creatively from you with the last couple of years of your life. I'm so curious to see how that's going to manifest. Do you know, does it have a shape yet, or is it still in process?
I'm working right now on 2 books, one about journaling as, a conduit for self-expression and growth. And the other is a book of essays and paintings. But I'm also trying, this sounds paradoxical, but I'm trying to schedule unstructured time for myself. Because
oh no, that makes sense to me. That makes complete sense.
Good. The one thing I've noticed in, these 2 moments of 2 different periods in my life of being bedridden is that they end up being the most creatively generative periods of my life. And that's because I don't have any expectations, because I've been forced to clear the deck. And because instead of, sticking to some plan of how something should go or what the logical next creative step is, I'm just open to everything. And I'm just kind of following my curiosity. And so I'm trying to preserve time for that, to just read and explore and doodle and see what comes out of it.
It's so wild you say this, because I have been also allowing the space and create. I literally on my schedule block out time to do nothing.
Yeah.
And I've been calling it following the threads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And following the threads every day. My intention is to follow the threads, and I don't know where they're going to come from. I don't know where they're going to lead, but I am following the threads. And for me, that means listening and allowing space for that very quiet, intuitive thought or action or concept, idea, allowing space for it to come forward, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. And, often when you're in that unstructured space, it can feel like you're not doing anything. And it's only much later that you realize that the thread started there. And that's been true for me, just in the last 2 years of painting. That was something I was doing just to, entertain myself and to try to transcribe some of these weird fever dreams that I was having. And I did it without any expectation of anything. And I think, we can hear our intuition most clearly when things get really quiet.
Interestingly, there's a woman I started working with who works with supporting you to connect with that creative intuition.
Mm.
it sounds so nebulous, and it's not even like woo-woo. It's like, if you were to meet her, she's not, like channeling anything, but like, it was so interesting that was, what you're talking about with that unstructured time, the fact that we have to unlearn doing in order to just be. We're human beings, not human doings.
Yes.
And that the space that needs to be created for creativity to come up. So much of our lives are so busy. Our minds are so busy that there is not space for it. And unlearning and undoing has been a real practice for me.
We're human beings, not human doings. You got to put that embroidered on a pillow or something.
I will.
But yeah, it's true. No one is going to give you the gift of time. No one is going to protect your time for you. We are obsessed with productivity and output, and it's something you have to prioritize for yourself. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. There's an infinite list of to-dos for each of us that we're never going to get to the end of.
Well, I'm starting a Substack because I was inspired by yours. So I am doing that. I am very late to the party, but I'm going to do it. Yeah.
I can't wait. What's it called?
It's the name of this series, The Conversation.
I love it.
So
I will be your first subscriber when it goes live.
Yay, thank you. And I love that because you're one of my 2 subscriptions that I do. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It has been such a treat and such a pleasure and such an honor to spend time with you. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. This has been a joy and such a gift to get to chat with you. And I volunteer as one of your new mentees when it comes to navigating the trials and tribulations of being married to a touring musician.
I will give you my phone number, and I would love it if you would text me and we can stay in touch.
I would love that.
I'm available for any of that, and I may call upon you as I navigate whatever creativity comes forward with me. Maybe I can be a mentee of yours for writing.
Please. And maybe you should take a kintsugi workshop.
This is the second time today that has come up. It came up in my morning group with my women. And when I went to Japan this summer, that is one of the things that I fell in love with.
I love it. How fun would it be to study all the different art forms where the source material are shattered things?
Ooh. Yes, that is a thread. That is a thread.
It is a thread.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. That is a thread. Oh, okay.
To following more threads.
Yes, to following more threads. Thank you so much for listening. I told you that was going to be a good one, right? As always, please remember to go to my Substack, amandadecadene.substack.com. Suleika inspired me to start my Substack, and so I have created that space for everyone that listens to this show to be able to join me there, to talk about the episodes, for me to share clips that didn't make it into the cut, behind the scenes stuff, and just to connect with you. So please find me on Substack, and as always, like, comment on social, subscribe, leave the reviews. Everybody knows what to do at this point, right? So if you have time to, please do any of those things. But most of all, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I know your time is valuable. One of the biggest gifts we can give anybody is our time, and I'm grateful for yours. Thank you.